Hello, it's Ren Presents time. I'm your host, Ren, and today we continue with the Hazards of the Old Ones, Part 3, Chapter 26, Lord Milton's Secret. So last week, Carahill was finally given his arms. He convinced the recovering Duke of Olin to risk himself to uncouple from the Seeker and fly his Goshawk out into the Shadowtech melee, thus endangering himself. And with that act, there was finally enough weight on the scale so that Carahill could cut loose and create a miracle on Xandar using the Brightstone that he had been given in the Hazards of the Old Ones by Lieutenant Kylos. He replicated himself into thousands, if not millions, of copies of himself and destroyed all the Shadowtech on Xandar. Also, after Captain Davidge put his call out, he started hearing Zappin chatter on the airways that various warlords and potentates were just hankering to get their claws on the remains of the planet Xandar and divvy up the spoils. Camilla of Sorander, who's always been kind of a fun character, she's never appeared in any of the books. She gets talked about every so often. She's a part of the League of Elder backstory. Her great-great-great-grandfather was Vi of Sorander, who fought at the planet Trimble in the Battle of the Tomb, where Queen Gome was finally unseated by the Brotherhood of the Murdered Queen. Just lots of backstory with Camilla, and one of her frequent things is she's just feasted her eyes on the planet Xandar, has wanted it to add it to her collection of fiefdoms, wanted to plant her lozenge, that's her coat of arms, which is for a lady, it's tipped on its side. Regardless of the fact that she has nothing to do with Xandar, she just wants it, and occasionally she would call for a truce, go to League space before the League X Commons, which is basically the ruling governmental body of the League, and proclaim that Xandar is hers, and she would even have the hot balls just to say, you need to send your fleet, you Leaguers, worship me and deliver me my fiefdom. Take your ships to Xandar, kill all those there, and bring unto me my planet. Well, they usually just laughed her off, gave her a time limit to get back to Zaffin space, or all bets would be off, and she could be killed in space, but that never happened. Always kind of lurking in the shadows and to get some of her boyfriends and potentates, be they male or female, to do her fighting for her. Of course, Camilla in the Battle of Xandar was a no-show. It's always a no-show. She's all hat, no cattle, as they say. So no Camilla, but Carahill was successful in sweeping the Shadowtech from the skies over planet Xandar. The various demons we had seen earlier, Mabs, Bar Igura, Ibelex, and poor Mayax, were freed as per Carahill's demands of the Celestial Arboreum. Once he was successful in saving the planet, the Arboreum would give Mabs and the rest a second chance and remove their status as demons, and the red scales fell off their eyes, and they're free to join the Celestial Arboreum again, all except for Mayax, who's so guilt-ridden that his eyes remained red. We'll see what happens with Mayax later on. So this week, Chapter 26, Lord Milton's Secret. Now, I have already spilled the beans on Lord Milton's Secret. Shame on me. I don't know what I was thinking. Probably it's my unmonetized status kept my brain from working properly, but I don't know. I think I just forgot the sequence events in my own book. It's been a long time since I wrote this. So let's go through this. Lord Milton's Secret. We already know what the secret is, but let's just do the perfunctory. Let's do the perfunctory thing and get through this chapter. Then we have one left, and we have a couple epilogues, and that is it. So let us proceed immediately. Lord Milton, as I'm sure you are all painfully aware by now, was not an elder like us, the Duke said, lying in his bed. He was in his quarters, still trying to recover from his gunshot wound, which, though perfectly healed, smarted like nothing else. Tori lay at his side asleep in a pair of flower print pajamas, her arms around him. The fixed by fin still shone on her neck and arm. She smiled as she slept. Through the window, many stray lights flew in formation in low orbit, finishing the cleanup of the Shadowtech ships and defending Xandar from raiders who might try to loot its remaining wealth. Sage was propped up in a nearby chair. He was gingerly eating a bowl of soup that Innes had given to him. His chest wound was also extremely tender. His whole body hurt. Peter and Poe stood near Sage. Though Lady Poe had been shot as well, she didn't seem to be suffering any ill effects. Out of view from everybody else, they held hands. Davidge leaned forward in his chair. So, no doubt his condition was part of the secret that had kept his house in sway all these generations. Yes, the Duke said. Was he cursed? Sig asked as she poured Davidge a cup of coffee. Coffee, Duke? No, thank you, Countess. He wasn't cursed. You see, that's what he, or rather she, or it, was. It all goes back to the time of the Elders. Of course, we all know that the Elders selected the ancestors of the 7 tribes to fare the heavens for them, to seek out stars for them that would nourish their needs, and in return they granted for the gift and the tribes gifts, youth and health, and thus beginning the League. They took our ancestors from wherever, now lost homeworld of old, and ventured with them across the cosmos to Lemuria, to Emira, to Camera and Ing, and eventually settling on Cana and Onaris. The old tribes in the Vith, however, were not the only race of beings the Elders sought out to fare the stars for them. They chose others as well. What? Davidge said. Tori stirred a bit and, smacking her lips, kissed the Duke on the shoulder and continued sleeping. Yes, these other beings were called the Hytath, and like the Vith, they were brought from far away and deposited on Cana. Like our ancestors, they were to serve the Elders. For what specific purpose, I do not know. I suppose the Elders expected everyone to get along and live harmoniously like beloved pets. However, the Hytath were strange and fierce, and they from the outset made war upon us and attempted to enslave the heroes of old, the tribes of Vith bearing the heaviest brunt of the attack. We all know the fanciful stories of giants in the earth and in the dark places that vexed and tasked the Vith. Well, it seems that they were not merely stories. The Hytath were the giants of legend. Additionally, the cities of Gamboa and Tyrol and the region of Esther, my home, were once ancient Hytath cities and strongholds. Yes, we all know of the Hytath of old. A rampant Hytath adorns our Blanchford coat of arms, Davidge said. I simply thought them a fanciful creature of myth. No, not at all. Also, it appears they developed a distinct taste for Vith flesh and sought to slay and eat them as cattle. This behavior stunned the Elders. They hadn't expected such a thing. They deported most of the Hytath back to their home world, wherever that might be, but a few remained, lost in the mountains and shadowy places of Cana, always lurking and always hungry. And so the gifts of the mind, the Elders sought to protect the Vith from the remaining Hytath. Armed with these new gifts, the Vith fought back and thrived under the leadership of Hama of Telmus Falls. But the Hytath could not be eliminated completely, and they lingered in the shadows, always ready to pounce, though occasionally they could be tamed to some extent if the proper strength was applied. It is said the original sisters were the product of Vith Hytath offspring as well, and every modern sister can trace a bit of Hytath in her lineage somewhere. Kai, sitting near Davidge, thought about the sisters with their monstrous heritage and shuddered for some reason. And so, Lord Milton, Davidge asked. Yes, As I said, most of the remaining Hytath were killed by the old Vith. Some hid in the mountains and the swamps and stayed there. Others snuck themselves into League society, hiding in plain sight. Such were the Miltons. The Duke swallowed, feeling his throat dry a bit. "Countess, I'm sorry, may I have that cup of coffee after all, please?" She got the Duke a cup and he drank it, wetting his throat. "It was the most bizarre creature I've ever seen," Poe said. "A hideous mixture of male and female parts." He was actually kind of hot, I thought, Johnny said. Just sort of crazed and mean-looking, but still rather hot. Nice bod. The Hytath start life as a male and are fairly indistinguishable from a standard Vith male, with the exception of being rather long and tall and no blue hair. They didn't have gifts in the strict sense of the word, but they could perform something similar to a cloak. Their skin, though soft and supple, was tough as nails, and they could stick to walls like a gecko. As they grew and got older, they began growing extra female parts, usually acquiring one complete set every 10 or 20 years. It wasn't uncommon for an adult Hytath to have 5 pairs of arms, 5 sets of breasts, 5 sets of mixed genitalia, and so forth. And their head, it seemed, wasn't a critical area, for if they lost their head, a new female head would grow back almost instantly. I have always believed that each female set of parts had its own consciousness and its own soul, and so Lord Milton was continuously hearing many voices in his head struggling for dominance, and the loudest voice was usually the most evil and brutal. Eventually, using their long male organ, they seeded the strongest of their own female parts and, for lack of better terms, self-replicated. Why did Lord Milton grow? Poe asked. Again, the giants of old, the Hytath, as they exerted themselves, grew in size. Milton was always careful not to overly exert himself. As they grew, they became more and more savage. A Hytath could often grow to 20 feet tall, at which point they were nothing short of a crazed berserker starving for Vith flesh. They shrunk back down as they calmed, but if they let themselves go too often, they'd become stuck in such a state. There at full size, their sanity often failed and their taste for Vith flesh increased. For many years, my father was able to control Lord Milton with certain drugs and extracts which calmed his horrific nature, and though he was a surly character, I believe for much of his youth he was happy as he was, just a grumpy accountant. As he aged, though, his true nature wasn't to be denied. All those voices in his head no longer silenced. He held my father under his thumb, and when I refused to submit, he began trying to kill me. His constant attempts to murder me got more and more violent and brutal with each attempt. Davidge thought a moment. How did his family come into your sway? The Duke took another sip from his coffee. My great ancestor, Terfal of Olin, met and felled a Hytath in battle centuries ago. The region of Esther, House Olin's ancient home, was plagued for generations by a creature from the bogs and marshes. A creature that stole children and abducted the wary or the unwise. The people cried out for the creature, whatever it was, to be killed, and Terfal, at that time bankrupt and down on his luck, answered the call with his Fenister whip. He set out into the marshes to hunt down and slay the beast, hoping that such a deed might change his fortunes. And discover it he did, a Hytath of a fearsome note, and they did battle in the marsh. Terfal, being powerful with the gifts, subdued the Hytath, and weeping, pleading, it begged him to spare its miserable life. She was very beautiful, though obviously monstrous. She promised to help Lord Terfal. She could easily assist him in any number of ways. She was strong, she could climb sheer walls and cliffs with just her hands, and she had an infallible memory. She never forgot anything. A bargain was struck. Terfal then returned to Esther with his gigantic head and received a large reward for his supposed deed. Several days later, Babala, lord of a little-known house of Milton, rolled into town. A very strange, gangly, somewhat sinister fellow who was said to be a downtrodden lord from Onaris, hoping to change his situation. But what of House of Milton? One cannot just make up a great house. The League Inquisitors and Duties Collectors would soon discover the truth. Davidge said. The House of Milton was an old Johnny house that migrated from Onaris long ago, trying to hack a new life for themselves out of the marshes surrounding Esther. Unfortunately, as they constructed their mansion, they happened upon the Hytath, who slaughtered them. When the Hytath struck into the bargain with Lord Terrafall, it simply assumed the name of Milton. The Hytath had access to House Milton's secret documents, its charters and patents, and it had access to the secret of constructing the Red Ha. Lord Milton went to work for Lord Terrafall and became his personal accountant and advisor, making him the first Duke of Olin. The relationship was a prosperous one. Lord Terrafall's initial reward, Windfall, was grown into a huge fortune with the help of Lord Milton, whose memory and an ability with numbers and calculations was a real plus. Draining the marshes, they discovered Lord Milton's ancient ancestral manor, and they also discovered the unfinished skeleton of the new manor and reclaimed it, now the standing estate of the House of Olin. Milton Manor, underneath the Esther veneer, is an ancient Hytath structure, which is why it's so big and out of scale. The South Manor, my current residence, is the structure that the original Miltons had attempted to build before they were killed. And for generations, the relationship was a productive one, as the successive lords of Milton, each self-replicating offspring of the original Hytath, behaved themselves and led quiet, respectable lives, seemingly domesticated into League society and enjoying its nuances. But the last few generations became more and more problematic. They became bitter and malcontented. The drugs used to control their appetites began to fail, and they looked to fill their bellies with Vith flesh all over again. And so Hershey, Lord of Milton, was the worst and most malcontented of the lot. My father, Lord Ursel, was terrified of him, the secret becoming a curse, for should it become known that the House of Olin had sheltered and aided the Hytath for centuries, what a ruinous scandal that would be. My father had no idea what to do with the evil fellow. Though he was rotten, he seemed to genuinely enjoy League society and had never shown an inkling to consume Vith flesh. Perhaps he himself could control his base nature better than he actually could. So what is to be done? Davidge asked. The Duke thought a moment. I shall bury Lord Milton in his ancient ancestral home, and then I am going to raze Olin Manor to the ground and rebuild elsewhere, probably somewhere a bit closer to Effington. I have a home to build for my future Duchess here, and I don't need those old ghosts interfering with our tomorrows. The Duke finished his coffee and set his cup down. So, Captain Sir, what is to become of me? What will you do with this secret and others that I have? There isn't a great house that doesn't have a thing or two hidden in its closet. My house certainly does. As for your illegal ships and your illegal activities, I'm not aware of you running anything that is harmful, and I'm also not aware of you going out of your way to hurt anyone in the process. So as far as I'm concerned, what you do or don't do is your concern. And if some tax collector or duties official out there finds his purse short, then so be it, and all the better. And regarding Lord Milton, who is to say that these creatures, these Hytath, don't have the right to try to coexist and at least try to build a life for themselves? Stories of these creatures abound in old Vith legend. Much of our past is rooted with them, and perhaps we owe them a debt for what has been passed down to us from old. What do you think? Countess Sig sat down next to Dav. Well, I say your secret is safe with us, Duke. Let it be buried and done with. The Duke smiled and lay back in his bed, Tori immediately enveloping him as she slept. They assembled in a small clearing near the River Tor, the ruins of Xandar Keep rising in the distance. A simple table had been set up on the grass, and various dishes made by the Seeker chef, Lord Ottoman, sat on the tabletop waiting to be eaten. All of the principals were there. Captain Davidge and his Countess Sigillis, the Duke of Olin, Tori Jane of Wham, the Ruthvens and Lady Poe of Blanchfort sitting next to Peter. Lieutenant Kylos and her Silverbird Tweeter and Lieutenant Verlin were also there. Several of the locals who flew into the sky full of Shadowtech ships were there, as well as a few of the tunnel dwellers whose diversion allowed Kai and Inez to get to the communications device. Near the head of the table was Balor, king of Xandar, king of a battered and smoking but unbroken world. At the head of the table was Carahil. 2 baskets were sitting next to him. One was filled with kittens, an exotic strain known as Xandar Pinks. The other was filled with young puppies, more refugees from the ruins of the keep. Balor stood and raised his glass. Dear friends, here we have assembled this evening, ready to share a wonderful meal by the banks of the Tor. By all rights, I and everybody else on Xandar should be dead. This should be the first day of Xandar's eternity. A black ring should be overhead, ready to pounce on any who might dare approach. But thanks to you all, thanks to your courage and timely arrival, thanks to your bravery and willingness to sacrifice, we live still. There is no black ring in the sky, and eternity yet awaits. Thanks to you, the people are safe. Today, we give thanks for our deliverance. Today, we begin the rest of our lives. And to the chief author of this happy outcome, to he who saw our deaths and was determined to avert them, to he who did not see enemies dying here, but simply people in need, I offer a special toast. All at the table stood and raised their glasses. To Carahil, Balor said. Defender of Xandar, to Carahil. Everyone at the table repeated. Carahil's silver face blushed, and he adjusted himself in his seat, preparing to say a few words. Before I start, I'd like to offer all in attendance a small gift as thanks for what was done here. In front of each person at the table, a small box with a festive bow appeared. It's not much, but it's from the heart. Please, everyone, open them. Sig scowled. What's in the box, Carahil? I don't trust you. Oh, please, my countess. This is a solemn occasion of the utmost gravity, and we all, myself included, have matured from this experience. There is a time for everything, and this certainly is not a time for levity. Please, accept this humble gift that is from my heart. Well, sounds reasonable to me, Davidge said, looking at his box. Everyone then, except for Davidge, pulled the lids from their boxes. Fat pies of cherry cream, chocolate, and custard launched themselves out of the boxes and unerringly found the faces of each person with a sweet slap. They wiped filling from their eyes. Davidge sighed and opened his box, getting hit with a cream pie. Carahil erupted in laughter and beat his flipper against the tabletop. I'm sorry, please. What's a pie into the face after what we have been through? Huh? Think of it like this. The defender of Xandar has just anointed you. They were shocked for a moment. Then Davidge began laughing as he wiped cream from Sig's face. Kai too, and then Sig joined. Soon the whole table was caught up in mirth. Xandar should be a silent tomb. Instead, the banks of the Tor bounded in laughter. And with that, we conclude part 3, chapter 26, Lord Milton's Secret. So, again, I'm sorry I had spilled the beans about Lord Milton a few chapters earlier. Sometimes, I wrote this book about 10 years ago. Sometimes you forget the sequence of events in your own book. So I let it go too soon. I'm sure you're all disappointed, right? Couple things in the Duke's dissertation. The High-Tath have grown and matured as the stories have grown and matured, and some of the things he said don't necessarily jive with the later High-Tath stories, where he says that the elders sent most of the High-Tath back, but that's not how it goes in later tellings, where the sisters beg the elders to get rid of these High-Tath just because they're just too warlike, too starving for Vith flesh. They were just running rampant in the north and elsewhere, devouring people, pulling them out of their homes, out of their beds, and throwing them on a bonfire and eating them raw and wiggling sometimes. So there was that whole thing where the elders took most of the High-Tath back. It's not the way it currently is basically the Vith and the other tribes of the elder kind had to deal with them themselves, and to help out, the elders provided the gifts of the mind to counter the High-Tath threat. Many of the old Vith heroes, we mentioned Hama of Telmus Falls, who's like one of the fathers of Vith mythology. And his wife, Emira of the Sword, was 30 feet tall, so it's suspected that she was a Hytath in disguise. Not too many elder kind are 30 feet tall, but she was, according to the stories. And their daughter, Subra of the Mark, was the first Shadow Tech female, and then their other daughter would eventually become the Black Abbess. She would become a Grand Abbess of the Sisterhood, and she would eventually become the Black Abbess herself, the head of the Black Hat Sisterhood, an utterly evil being later on. She didn't start off that way, but that's what she became. And other heroes, such as Holt of the Mountain, all can trace their deeds back to Hytath activity. And like the Duke said, the Hytath weren't always just savage and bestial. They could be tamed, as we saw in the Bloodstein books. Leica was a Hytath warrior, and she was a firm ally of Lord Cable of Blanchford, although she had witnessed him in battle and he saved her life in the city of Wham. So she was very loyal to him, and she even offered herself just because she admired his ability to fight, and that's very attractive to Hytaths. They find that very stimulating. And he also allowed her to get some sleep, and usually Hytath don't need sleep, but if you let them sleep, they become in a much more aroused state. And also, as they mentioned, they have eidetic memories that they don't ever forget anything that they see, hear, or touch. They always remember it, so they're very good with numbers and so forth. So that's why Lord Milton was a very good accountant. And then the King of Xandar, Balor I, assembles a group of people to have a feast by the River Tor to celebrate their deliverance and to give thanks to Carahil. Mabs had said that the people of Xandar would call Carahil a god, and he didn't do that. He called Carahil a friend, the defender of Xandar. He never just up and called him a god, which I thought was an important distinction to make. Next week, our final chapter, chapter 27, the George Wind. There's a few things that need to be taken care of, a few loose threads that have gone unclosed. And if you think I forgot about some of these things, I forget nothing. So next week we're going to take care of that. And there's a misprint in this book. There's actually a chapter 28 which also says chapter 27. It's very short. We can deal with that one next week also, maybe, if the George Wind one isn't too long. So we're gonna clean up some loose threads, and then we'll be done with the book. Until then, this is Ren Presents. I am your host, Ren. Peace